Welcome back. This is day 2 of JavaScript Fundamentals, and before we get started, I want to prepare you that I'm going to throw a lot of terminology at you today. So if you're new to programming, I recommend that you write down these terms and their definitions because they're not unique to JavaScript, but they are unique to the programming industry in general. So today we're going to talk about data. And the reason being because whenever we write software, that software is going to work with data in some way, shape, or form. For example, let's just look at the code that we wrote in day 1. We call the alert function, which tells the browser to pop up a new little window to display a message. But it doesn't know what message that we want it to display. We have to provide that data in order so the alert function can do what it's supposed to do. So this textual data that we have passed is data, except that we don't call it textual data in programming. We call this a string, as in it's a string of characters. And every programming language has to provide us what are called data types. They are literally types of data that allow us to work with different types of data in our code. So for example, the JavaScript language gives us a data type called string so that we can work with text in our code. And to create a string, we surround some text with a pair of double quotes. So our string hello world begins with one double quote and ends with a double quote. So anything in between these two quotation marks are part of the same string. But we can also create strings using a single quote instead of a double quote. So we begin the string with a single quote and end the string with a single quote. But we can't mix and match these together. If we begin a string with a double quote, we have to end it with a double quote. And the same is true for single quotes. We can't begin one with a double quote and end it with a single quote. I don't know if you can tell, but the color coding has changed in that all of this is red. So in Web Matrix, strings are denoted by a red color. So everything from hello, JavaScript fundamentals, and then even this single quote and this parenthesis and the semicolon are all considered a string because we haven't ended the string with a double quote because we began it with a double quote. So just keep that in mind. We can't mix and match, but we can create a string in two different ways. Just to be clear on mixing and matching, you cannot begin a string with one type of quote and end it with another type of quote, but you can include a single quote inside of a string that is delimited by double quotes. So let's go to hello world and we can do it's apostrophe s. And this is perfectly fine. We don't have to match this quote at all because it is actually part of the string. And since our string is delimited by double quotes, that's perfectly fine to do. And the reverse is true for single quotes. So if we surround our string with single quotes, we can contain double quotes inside of our string. And once again, we don't have to match them at all. We can have one if we wanted, but with double quotes, you typically have two within the same string. This ability to create strings in different ways, using double quotes or single quotes, is a little unique in the programming world. There are some languages that allow you to do the same thing, but they treat those strings a little bit differently. JavaScript doesn't discriminate. If you create a string with double quotes, it's exactly the same as creating a string with single quotes. So you can choose whichever way you want to go. I personally like double quotes because in other programming languages, double quotes are how you define a string. A lot of PHP developers that pick up JavaScript typically go for the single quote approach. It really doesn't matter just as long as you are consistent. Well, let's take a slight detour and talk about memory and storing values in memory, because most of the time we want to store a value in memory so that we can refer to it later on in our code and refer to it as many times as we want. For example, we have a value, a string value that has hello world in it. And this is a string literal. It literally appears within our code, but there's going to be times when we have values that are not literally in our code. But in this case, we do. But we might also want to store this in memory so that we can refer to this particular value, this string value, without having to retype the string hello world many times. So we do this by creating what's called a variable. It's just a box of memory that we can store stuff in. That's pretty much all it is. And we create a variable by first saying var. Var is a keyword, and a keyword has a special meaning to the JavaScript engine. So whenever it sees var, it knows that we want to create a variable. And you have to put a space after var, just because if you start typing something, then the JavaScript engine doesn't know what this is. It sees var at the beginning, but it's not the keyword var. The keyword var is var followed by a space. After the var keyword, we want to provide a name for our variable because we need some way to refer to it in our code. And variable names can begin with a lowercase letter, an uppercase letter, an underscore, or a $sign. You cannot begin a variable name with a number, but you can use numbers in a variable name. Most of the times you want to begin a variable with a lowercase letter, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But after that first character is written, then you can include numbers. But unless if this means something to you, don't do it. There are times when numbers are going to be something that makes sense for a variable name. But for many purposes, something textual is going to be sufficient because you want to look at a variable name and know what it's supposed to contain so that whenever you're reading you can say, this variable is supposed to do this variable is supposed to keep track of this, and so on and so forth. If you have a cryptic variable name, you're not going to get very far. So I'm going to call this variable, and this is going to be a little confusing and difficult to explain, but I enjoy the challenge. So we have var space, and then the name of the variable, which in this case is variable, and then we can end this statement with a semicolon. Now, JavaScript actually allows us to omit semicolons. It will try to be smart and insert them for us, but do not omit the semicolon. Yes, JavaScript will try to insert a semicolon for you, but sometimes it can do so in the wrong place, which would make your code fail. And the thing is, you wouldn't know that your code is failing because you wouldn't get an error or anything like that, but it would behave in a way that it was not supposed to. So always use the semicolon at the end of every statement. It's only a character, and it's actually going to be required in a future version of the language. So get your practice in now. Okay, so with this line of code, we have done what's called declared a variable. So we've declared the variable. I've got to change this. This is going to be too confusing to say variable. Okay, so I've changed this to my variable. We have declared a variable called my variable, but we haven't given it a value. In fact, by default, it has a value of undefined. The JavaScript language has a data type called undefined, and it has only one value, undefined. And that kind of makes sense because the value has not been defined yet. But we can define that value by using the variable name followed by an equal sign and then the value that we want this variable to contain. Hello world. So this line 2, this statement is called two different things. It's an assignment statement because we have assigned a value to a variable, and it's also called a variable initialization statement. So if line 1 is a variable declaration statement, line 2 is a variable initialization statement. And now that this variable has a value, we can use it just like we would the actual hello world value. So we can pass the variable to the alert function, and we should get the same results that we got in day 1, seeing hello world in an alert box. And just to let you know that this is in fact what's going on, let's add some gibberish to the end of the string, run it again, and there we go. Okay, so this is how we use variables. We declare them, we define them, and then we use them in our code. But there are going to be times when we don't want to do this in 2 lines, the declaration and the initialization. There are going to be times when this is required because we might not have a value for a variable. But most times we know what a variable is going to contain, so we can do the declaration and the initialization all in one statement by just saying var and then the variable name, the equal sign, and then the value that we want to assign to this variable. So if we ran this again in the browser, we would get the same results. Before we move on, I want to talk about our variable name. Now remember I said that we should name our variables according to their purpose or the value that they contain. Well, the purpose of this variable has been for demonstration, but it's not representative of its value. The value hello world, we're not going to change. This variable will always contain hello world. So it would make sense if we named this variable hello world. Now notice what I've done here. I have uppercased the W in world, and this is a convention of JavaScript called camel casing. Well, camel casing is used in a lot of programming languages, but it's the convention of JavaScript to name your variables in camel case fashion. So what is camel case? Well, if you have multiple words in a name, the first word is all lowercase, and this is why I said you will more than likely begin a variable with a lowercase letter. So the first word is all lowercase, and then any word after that first word begins with an uppercase letter. So W in world is uppercased. If we had other words in this, we would have an uppercase letter for that first letter. So hello world, and then 3 is capitalized, 4 capitalized, 5 capitalized. So it makes it a little bit easier because each word is broken up with a capital letter. So this is camel casing. It is a convention of JavaScript. And as you're reading other people's code, you might run across something that looks like this, using an underscore to separate the different words. Now, there's nothing technically wrong with this code. This is a perfectly valid variable name, but it doesn't follow JavaScript conventions. In fact, this follows PHP conventions. And you will find a lot of code where PHP developers decided to get into JavaScript, but they didn't adopt the JavaScript conventions. And I don't mean to sound haughty or preachy about this. This is just a pet peeve of mine. It doesn't matter what language you're writing in, follow the conventions of that language. So if you're writing in PHP, follow PHP's conventions. If you're writing JavaScript, follow JavaScript conventions. C++, follow C++ conventions. It just makes things easier for you, and it makes it easier for whoever's reading your code. So just follow the conventions of the language. Since this is JavaScript, the convention is camel casing, so use it. And while we're on the subject of casing, it's important to note that JavaScript is case sensitive. So I've written a line of code that assigns a new value to the hello world variable, but there's a slight little difference, as you've probably noticed. This one has an uppercase R, whereas our original hello world variable has a lowercase r. Well, what we end up actually doing is creating a new variable called hello world with an uppercase R. Even though we didn't use the var keyword, we can create a variable like we've done in line 2, but we don't ever want to do that. And I didn't really want to demonstrate this to you because it's considered very bad practice to create a variable without the var keyword. But in the case of this code, that really wasn't our intent. We wanted to assign a new value to our original hello world variable, and because of a typo, we now have a bug in our code because hello world with a lowercase r is a different variable than hello world with an uppercase R. They are two different variables, two different boxes of memory. So as you're writing code, be sure that your casing is correct, because you could introduce a bug just from a simple typo. I know, I've been there, and just about every other developer has been there as well. Well, let's look at some of the other data types in JavaScript. One of them is called number, which allows us to work with numeric data within our code. So let's create a new variable called 10, and we will assign it a value of 10. And this is a numeric literal, just like we have string literals. With hello world, we have numeric literals as well. We can have numbers that are whole numbers like 10, or we can have fractional numbers. So I've created another variable called pi to contain 3.14. Now I know that there are other decimal places, but I only know the two. The last data type we'll talk about today is probably the simplest data type that there is. It's called Boolean, Boolean, and it closely resembles that of a bit. A bit can either be on or off. A Boolean value can be either true or it can be false. And those are the two literal values for a Boolean value, true or false. Well, I think this is a good place to stop for today. I've introduced you to the three basic data types in JavaScript: strings, numbers, and Boolean values. Tomorrow we will continue to look at data and how we can work with those numbers and strings. We'll look at how we can convert numbers to strings and strings to numbers. We'll also do some math. We'll join some strings together and all of that wonderful stuff. So get ready for that. Have a good one.